Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Earlier this week, Jordan's King Abdullah II appointed his chief of staff, Jafar Hassan, to form a new government following last week's parliamentary elections. The Hashemite Monarch has commendably been trying to modernize the kingdom's political system so as to better reflect the views and aspirations of a restless new generation. The problem, however, is that the most adamant element in the Jordanian public, a distinct minority, though not yet a majority, is Islamic and bitterly anti-Israeli. The border with Israel, which used to be quite secure, is now porous, enabling a terrorist to sneak through inspections and kill 3 Israelis. This is also a testament to Iranian efforts to use Jordan as a corridor through which weapons and explosives are smuggled to the West Bank terror cells. Is the Hashemite regime strong enough to withstand these pressures? To analyze it, we're joined from Washington, D.C. by retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly a senior director at the National Security Council for Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and many other countries in the region, U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, as well as Deputy Undersecretary for Jordan, among others. It's good to see you, Joel, in addition to, of course, being the founding director for the American Center for Levant Studies and a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. I can go on and on, of course, but we'll stop there. It's a pleasure to have you. Also joining us from Central Israel is Dr. Neil Boms, research fellow at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, among a long list of other positions as well, of course. It's great to see you as well, Neil.
Here.
And the pleasure is ours. And with us in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amil Oren. Amil, take it away.
Well, as Abdullah II's late father, some would say late great father, King Hussein, used to quote Shakespeare, "Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown," especially in Jordan, especially for Hussein, who was the subject of multiple assassination attempts, and his son, while already in power for a quarter century, nevertheless has a lot of problems on his hands. Jordan being a problematic country geographically, demographically, and the security relationship between Israel and Jordan has been good to excellent. But nevertheless, there are problems, and we have seen that Iran has tried to smuggle weapons through Iraq to Jordan, and through Jordan to the Jordan Valley, which is on the western side of the Jordan River, and the Jordan Valley and Samaria, the northern part of the West Bank, are, of course, connected. And this has become quite a security problem from Israel, especially since we saw the terror act in the border crossing. And the perpetrator did not have the profile one would expect. It was not a Palestinian. He was not a Palestinian, and he had no prior record of any anti-Israeli activity. This should be quite of concern to the king, because the mainstay of the king's power base in Jordanian society used to be the Bedouin tribes, who are not usually in cahoots with the Palestinians, and especially not with Hamas. And maybe the demographic shifts and the political winds are turning against the king.
Indeed. Well, Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to hear your take on the latest developments. Obviously, the new prime minister, an economist, is a signal of the king's intention. What can you specify about it, knowing also the various figures at hand?
Well, Jafar Hassan is a very distinguished economic scholar. He's a PhD economist who has written a book on the history of Jordan's economic development. And he's been essentially in his position as chief of the royal court. He's been, I think, de facto the king's economic strategy planner. So I think it really signals, I think, a level of seriousness from the king to give the reins of the entire government over to basically the guy who's been helping to formulate the ideas behind trying to make Jordan's economy economically viable, to grow it, and to focus on the sectors that have the greatest potential for growth. So I think it's all to the good. I think it's really good stuff because Jordan's been hurting economically for quite some time. They've been pinched by conflicts all around them, as well as just sort of the internal constraints to economic growth and self-sufficiency, including, the burden. We have to face it. I mean, the Jordanian officials have been saying this for a long time, and for a long time, I myself have sort of downplayed some of their concerns personally, but I think recently it's the refugee problem in Jordan. The burden of refugees has been quite weighty on an economy that's been sort of anemic naturally, because Jordan isn't gifted with some of the same natural resources as the Arab countries around it. So Jordan has to be very smart in how it develops its economy, have a plan. It can't just sort of stick a straw in the ground and then have the liquid gold come up. It doesn't have that. It has other things going for it. It has human capital. It has sunlight to be able to. If there's any place in the world where solar power is going to be viable as a major energy source, Jordan should be that. But there are a lot of sort of institutional constraints and social constraints, socioeconomic constraints. But I think Jafar is the perfect person who's been living with those, analyzing them his entire career to try to formulate ideas for how to overcome those obstacles and take advantage of Jordan's natural advantages. So I think it's a really good sign, I think, in other words, for Jordan's economic viability, that this is the guy who's going to be gearing the government toward implementing what I think was a vision that the king had already essentially signed off on.
Indeed, and he articulated it also in different fora around the world, his intention to do so, and has been also very vigorous, both in Washington as well as in Europe, meeting with various representatives and lawmakers, people of note, in order to raise the banner of his kingdom in the necessity also to deal with the challenges at hand. But with that being said, not everybody is rooting for the king and the monarchy that has been prevailing since British mandate to date. Dr. Bohms, when we're talking about the security concerns, the Jordanian monarch had to contend and still does with various malign actors, particularly that of the Islamic Republic of Iran, various proxies engulfing the northern border from Syria all the way also to the border with Iraq, where we see the deployments of Hashd al-Shabi, the Liwa Fatimiyun brigades, the Liwa Zainibiyun brigades, and others, applying some pressure, and not only pressure, but also utilizing Jordanian territory for the smuggling of illicit materials, including drugs, including munitions, including funds for various purchases of loyalties from various clans, particularly also in northern Samaria, where there have been very active to try and sway a group of clans in order to align themselves with the interests of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Well, and everything you've said, Jonathan, becomes more problematic because they're applying this pressure through some of the former allies of the king, mainly the tribes in the south and the tribes in the north. The person who blew himself up is a part of a southern tribe called Hawitat, and this is a tribe that is based in Jordan, but also in the Sinai and also in Saudi Arabia. And this is known that some of the network associated with this tribe became more connected with radical and Islamist factions. They also some Wahhabi influence that still exists from Saudi Arabia. And we remember just a few months ago in April, we've seen another case in the same crossing with a member of parliament that actually this time came from the northern part, smuggled 200 guns, a number of M16s. They were caught, but this is a very significant quantity of weapons. It caught the Jordanians as well by surprise because it simply passed all of their security. It was caught on the Israeli side. and that was a sign that the Bedouins, who have been the allies of the king, are becoming less united and have other interests. The tribes of the south on the one hand and the tribes of the north on the other have had various issues. And in the north, they have been connected, as you've said, to the networks of drug smuggling. This network goes to Syria and all the way to Bashar al-Assad and his brother himself. If you go to the northern part of Jordan and to the border crossing, you see mansions, houses that you would not even imagine that you would see in a Middle Eastern country. But this is all drug money, and it's very noticeable. And somebody told me that it's easier to get a gun in the northern part of Jordan than to get some basic ingredients in the supermarket. And all of that, of course, eventually goes our way. And of course, it worries the king a fair bit, because part of the network that had always kept its regime, it's that the control and the balances in Jordan, and that in the time of his father we're working much more in unison, is becoming weaker, and the tactics of the Jordanian king have always been, when there is a crisis point, one of the first things we do is also replace the government. This is a fairly common and frequent occurrence in Jordan. So we have good news in the context of the potential direction, but this does not sort all the problems that the king has. And of course, from the Israeli side, it is also Jordan is facing a challenge. Jordan is always very sensitive to the Palestinian problem, considering the fact that the majority of Jordan's population is of Palestinian descent. The king have very much tried to bring this idea of we're all Jordanians, but of course the Palestinians are part and parcel of the society. And Temple Mount is an important symbol, and when Israel indicates that there may be changes there, that gets the population further agitated, and it gets the Jordanians, it's more difficulty for them to stop all these initiatives. They're not really coming from the royal court, but very much exist. And this is really the context of some of what we've seen in the Allenby crossing and in the riots across the border, where you had Palestinians willing to just cross the border and join the fight to protect the Temple Mount or to protect Gaza, something that was prevented so far. Still, all in all, this does not mean that the palace is falling tomorrow. There's still checks and balances, and actually, interestingly enough, some of them even come from the Palestinians in Jordan who are not interested that all hell will break loose and that the king will fall.
Indeed. Well, with regard to the one who perpetrated the terror attack in Allenby Crossing, he was actually, the Hawitat have different branches. He was part of the branch that remained loyal at the time of Faisal ibn Hassan al-Hashimi, the Hassan Sharif of Mecca and Medina. He was not part of the Hawitat that supported him. He was rather the part of those who remained loyal to the Ottoman Empire, and therefore the allegiances are sometimes with the nuances. We won't go into all of this. It takes a lifetime to study them. But nonetheless, it is a significant point to make that those that were loyal to Faisal and went down those lines within the various tribes withstood very significant challenges over the years and remained loyal to the king and remain loyal to date in a very vigorous manner. And therefore, that is quite significant. With regard to the drug money and the drugs, we heard King Abdullah II travel to one of the latest leadership summits of the Arab League, during the course of which he did highlight the challenge of the drug smuggling, particularly from the Der'a region and the various areas in particularly Syria, but also Iraq, something that, of course, the GCC countries were very vigorous against when it affected their own populations and secluded, basically established boycotts on Lebanon and other locations.
Well, that's the old story of the Nexus criminal activity and terror. And of course, this only makes the problem more complicated. But the root of the problem is that Israel's greatest strategic asset is the peace agreement, or the two peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan. But these are still government to government relations. It's not people to people. The population in both Egypt and Jordan is vehemently anti-Israeli. And while Israeli tourists usually can go and visit the sites in Jordan, it is not recommended for them to act in an open fashion in Amman. The Israeli embassy in Amman is not really operating. Over the weekends, it's closed because the diplomats go on Sunday or Monday from Jerusalem to Amman and back on Thursday evening. It's a fortress, the embassy, and it's better than nothing. It's good that we have these relations between the security services and the military. It's all for the good. But it's
Well, back in 2009, there were bombing attempts
yes,
against
but, of
Israeli
course,
convoys.
But it's skin deep. That's a problem. There is no deep reservoir of not a pro-Israeli sentiment, but of the understanding that this is for the benefit not only for the kingdom, but for all Jordanians.
Indeed. Colonel Rayburn, hearing the various perspectives, what can the king do in order to direct his government in accordance with Jordanian interests to try and preserve what is good and contest and ultimately alter all the various challenges that there are some quite powerful actors in the region with clear determination to alter the course of history for this monarchy?
Well, I think that the monarchy is the monarchy is more stable. I think it's more secure than some of its adversaries had hoped. So I don't think the Jordanian monarchy is under existential threat, at least not right now. But it does have some really difficult problems and that are creating conflicting internal policies that sort of counteract one another and make Jordan's way more difficult in the region and in the world. Now, Jordan has an extraordinarily capable intelligence apparatus, an intelligence community. It has a very capable military. And those guys both are engaged in an hour-by-hour war, essentially, against the Assad regime and against the Iranian regime and its proxies, who are seeking to get their tendrils into Jordan, to get across Jordan and to be able to extend their reach into the West Bank to try to destabilize. What they're essentially trying to do is to attack Jordan as basically a buffer state of Israel or a de facto, a peace treaty ally of Israel in order to clear the way so that the Iranians can seize decisive influence on another border of Israel in the service of their crazy ideological manufactured fake war against Israel that doesn't have any natural security reason in Iranian actual organic security in the region. So that's happening. So you have a security establishment in Jordan that needs the relationship with Israel, relies on it minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, in order to keep Jordan safe from this external threat, but also the internal threats from militancy that rise up that have always been there. At the same time, within the Jordanian, I think, political class and intelligentsia, there's sort of a breezy hostility to Israel that's really gotten off the charts since October 7th. And the attitudes of that class in Amman is shocking. I think the perception there is that Israel is conducting a terror campaign against the Palestinian population. So everything that you see bandied about in the regional media, the most hostile regional media, and even the media that's put out by the Iranian regime, Assad regime, and Hezbollah, that's sort of taken, that almost represents the attitudes, I think, of a lot of the chattering class in Amman. and that then manifests itself in some of the foreign policy steps that the Jordanian foreign minister in particular has been taking over the last almost year, such as helping to push the action against Israeli officials at The Hague, the cases against Israel in The Hague. I mean, that's happening at the same time that the Jordanian security arms are reliant on Israeli support to try to keep Jordan from falling under greater threat from the Iranian, Assad, and Hezbollah, and so on, and the Iraqi Hashid. These things are working at cross purposes, and they're really in the same way that the king, I think, has clarified his economic strategy, and he's now handed it over. He's made it clear he's going to hand over the leadership of the government to someone who's going to really break through, I think, the red tape and really get the arms of the Jordanian government to implement that economic strategy that the king's been formulating for a long time. I think he's going to have the same problem. He's going to have to reconcile these two competing policies within his own state machinery. One which is very hostile to Israel, and one which is reliant on Israel, and which is, of course, extreme value of service to Israeli security as well. And it's been extraordinarily successful, you have to say, since last October, in preventing a spillover of deep instability and an explosion in the West Bank, which I think many people would have expected. I kind of anticipated it myself, and it hasn't happened. I think that's down to the very close working relationship between the Jordanian security establishment and the Israeli security establishment, and those things are being undermined by Jordan's foreign policy right now in many ways.
Absolutely. Well, it's never too late to alter that policy, and hopefully the Jordanian officials watching right now can take that to heart. Dr. Boms?
Well, just to also remind that the Jordanians are dependent on Israel, not just when it comes to security. We are providing water to Jordan. And this is a very significant point that perhaps not all the Jordanians are even aware that without the water agreement, probably many of the taps in Amman would not have water, not to mention other parts of the country. There's other cooperation when it comes to agriculture and development, and that has been going on. And some of the elite in Jordan, and sometimes when you meet them, certainly in private talks, they would remind you that they have actually spent some time in a training institution in Israel, and that there's been very constructive work done. Of course, this is not that popular, and it's not something you can usually speak about in public. But the relationship between the states and the establishments are close. Before the peace agreement with Jordan, these relationships were also in existence. This is partially why it was a little easier to do. Still, public opinion is a factor, even in a non-democratic country. And as we've seen, certainly of late, it's becoming more difficult to control the populace, the tribes, and some of the stakeholders in Jordan. And therefore, the king needs to continue with a significant balancing act. It needs to keep its position vis-a-vis the Temple Mount, which in many ways is a part of one of the most important symbolic elements of his kingship. Otherwise, he controls a weak country that is not that significant, but the Temple Mount gives an added value to this. And again, without some coordination with Israel and looking at some of the developments when it comes to this area, all of this makes it even more precarious.
Second to Israel, I think that Jordan is the closest ally of the United States in the region. Of course, we will all remember in 2014 when the Russians deployed roughly 10,000 troops at the time to the area of Latakia and Tartus. The American answer was the deployment of some 10,000 Marines, if I'm not mistaken, to Syria to counterbalance the Russian deployment, followed, of course, with various maneuvers since then. 10 years have passed and many things have evolved, but nonetheless, unfortunately, the last Iranian attack that was directed at American forces that brought about a deadly outcome, Tower 22 in northeast Jordan, has brought the horrific result of 3 American service members killed and another couple dozen wounded in separate degrees, including in really severe degrees. So our prayers remain with those troops who have been wounded. But that area remains a very tough point. In 1 minute, what can you tell us about
Well, the triangle of the Israeli, Jordanian, and Syrian borders.
Very strategic.
Very strategic, and the eastern part of that area is close to Iraq, which is why Atanef is a very important area for the Americans to keep troops there, even after they withdrew from most of Syria. And the Americans are relying, and rightly so, on Jordanian special forces. They have their Eagle Lion exercise quite frequently. The Jordanian royal family is entrenched in the Jordanian Air Force and in the special forces. I think women too, not only the male members.
Well, the princess was...
Right, not only the male members of the family.
The princess was... pictures were taken of her participating in the defense of Jordanian skies during the Iranian attack against Israel on the night between the 13th and 14th of April.
Ever since 1948, the Israeli military has held the Jordanian military in high regard.
Right. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today, and the Jordanian story is far from over. So we will revert in the future to deliberate this further. But nonetheless, I'd like to thank Dr. Bohms, Colonel Rayburn, and Mr. Owen for all of your insights.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next edition from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Eran Lerman. I used to be Deputy National Security Advisor to the Government of Israel, currently Vice President of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a think tank, and the editor of the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune. For the last few years, I've been a regular panelist for TV7, a fantastic opportunity to bring deep and analytical perspectives to the debate over regional affairs, Israeli affairs, international affairs, in the company of some of the best minds in Israel.